Good afternoon. My name is Troy Stangerone. I'm the Senior Director for Congressional Affairs and Trade here at the Korea Economic Institute, and I'd like to thank you all for coming today. As you all know, South Korea has had a very successful Winter Olympics, and during that same period, we have had calm on the Korean Peninsula. But has sanctions begin to take more effect, and has the Olympics after the Paralympics come to an end? The question is sort of what comes next. Will sanctions push us into talks? How will North Korea handle the economic pressure? Is it willing to simply take and absorb the costs from economic sanctions? These and other questions are all sort of laying out there as sort of what comes next in terms of how we address the North Korea issue. And I think when we look at the impact sanctions are going to have on the Korean economy or North Korean economy and what options we have going forward, we're very fortunate today to have both Dr. Kim and Bill Brown and Scott Snyder, who all have significant experience both with North Korea, with its economy, and the players in the region. And so, because we're a little behind, I'm just going to very briefly take and give you their bios, but you have the longer bios with you. As I'm sure you all know, Dr. Kim Jong-ho is currently a visiting scholar at George Washington University's Institute for Korean Studies. For 8 years, he served as a senior research fellow at the Research Institute for North Korea and Northeast Asia Development at the Export-Import Bank of Korea. Next to him, we have Bill Brown, who is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He's also a non-resident fellow here for us at KEI. He previously taught at George Washington University's Elliott School of Foreign Affairs and George Mason University's Graduate School of Public Policy. He also has a lengthy career both in the intelligence community and the Department of Commerce. Next to him, we have Scott Snyder, who is the Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and the Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he served as an adjunct fellow from 2008 to 2011. Prior to joining CFR, Scott was a Senior Associate in the International Relations Program of the Asia Foundation, where he founded and directed the Center for U.S.-Korea Policy and served as the Asia Foundation's representative in Korea from 2000 to 2004. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kim.
Thank you, Troy. Thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful place. This forum is a very much timely and deals with a very critical issue. But I will touch this issue at a lower level, and the two experts will make it leveled up. The North Korean economy, well, simply speaking, was designed to sustain with foreign inputs. So without foreign inputs, North Korean economy is supposed to stumble. Self-sufficiency policy has been applied and emphasized for many decades, but it didn't change the economic landscape. As we all know, the novel Animal Farm, there is no equality in North Korea. So there is the exploitation over the people in North Korean economy. I will slightly touch the political feature of the North Korean economy. Okay. Most of us know about North Korea partially. It features authoritarianism, totalitarianism, collectivism, and cliquishness. Those political features all affect way of operation in North Korean economic system. It is called as a dual economy nowadays. The Kim Jong-Un regime is practicing the Pyongyang style of a public-private partnership, combining public authority over business projects by using private funds. But that kind of a style of a business features brokerage and corruption. And Kim Jong-un administration, Kim Jong-un regime, has designated 5 special economic zones at the national level, and at the more than 19 special economic zones at the local level. The only goal of those special economic zones designation is to attract more foreign investment. But they are not ready, and Kim Jong-un economy introduced high technology innovation in order to update the system. Kim Jong-un addressed the importance of the introduction of a CNC, computer numerical control, in his appearance to the public. So, but mass production campaign still is going, and management technique never changes. It is renamed in a different way, but it pushes people to produce more. Well, the kind of reformist gestures were introduced sporadically. 2002, 2012, 2014, there were several management improvement measures were introduced, but they are tested partially at only several locations. But most autonomous decision-making power given to the local farmers or farm managers are not working properly. What the economy lacks, you already know. They lack in food, energy, proper input, advanced technology, autonomy, and balanced foreign trade and actual foreign investment. Despite lots of memoranda signed by foreign investors, and lacks in access to foreign markets too. What makes the economy worse? Yeah, of course, military spending and nuclear and missile development program inviting tougher sanctions, and institutional competition causes lots of tension on political system and structure, and it is the waste of resources. We see the mysterious part of the North Korean economy with several indexes. GDP growth rate shows to be positive, and there seems to be inflowing cash around 300 or 500 million dollars in Pyongyang, and unofficial price of a luxury apartment reaches up to $200,000 in 2016, and the construction boom brings about lots of materials and capitals input into the North Korean economy, and cellophane taxi gas station that are what we didn't witness in the past. So this picture shows that how they are interacting together. There is one economy based on Korean won, Korean currency. The other economy based on hard currency, American dollars over Chinese yuan. Foreign traders, foreign investors approach North Korean dollar-based economy, but there are brokers and government agents. They launch projects and attract investment. And one of a miracle that North Korea is showing is the import of well-manufactured goods into the market of North Korea. For example, brand name sneakers are dumped to North Korea. Well, if you see a brand name sneaker at the department store at the value of 100% value, but if you go to the outlet, the same brand name sneakers. Of course, after 1 year, 2 years, they lowered in value. And international traders pick up that kind of a manufactured goods and then import to China and then bring them to North Korea, only at the price of $1. So now the North Korean economy was a centrally planned economy, but it is now capitalistically pulled economy. So this kind of economy is under sanctions. And as we all know, there are many sanctions measures introduced by the UN and the US and the European Union and South Korea, Japan. You know that these measures shifted the focus from the trade, from banning the trade of weapons, then to trade of money, and then trade of oil, textiles, minerals, and then banning the trade of prohibited goods on high seas. So the recently we heard about the U.S. Treasury's sanctions with the sanctions measures that they're punishing 1 person and 27 companies and 28 ships. Yes. Actually, sanctions effectiveness must be proven with one of these 2 pictures. The second one is the ideal type of a sanction regimes. As we already mentioned, there must be indexes to evaluate sanctions effectiveness. Price exchange rate should change if the sanctions impact the economy. Growth rate and trade investment should change. And actually domestic changes, including the changes of economic and political institutions and personnel, as a good indicator. Usually we skip. Mass mobilization reflects the pressure from the outside, and increase of official and unofficial markets, nowadays reaching up to the number of 800. And decrease of North Korean workers overseas is one of the indicators, and closure of North Korean embassy, business, and joint ventures, banks overseas. But they are not perfect. So as you see, North Korea's trade with neighbors show the decrease only in the case of a trade with South Korea and Japan, but trade with China is an exception. And despite sanctions, North Korean economic growth rate shows a positive after negative. So exchange rate observed during the period of spring of 2017 and the January of 2018. There was the UN sanctions measures adopted last September, and the exchange rate has soared up, but it came down, and it looks to be stable. The rice price, of course, it rose up around in September, but it went down. Okay, why don't we find the expected results of the sanctions? Foreign traders and foreign investors in an official realm are cut off, but there are many small businesses and small investors that still access North Korean market with the help of brokers and North Korean government agents. So we do not harvest the expected fruit. Okay, next step. Having said the contents of sanctions and the state of the North Korean economy, what will the U.S. do? And what will the North Korea do and South Korea's future choices? Yeah, they are our questions. Is it easier for a camel to go through a needle's eye than for Kim Jong-un with nuclear weapons to go to the summit with Trump? Well, it's a question we can listen these days. Realist perspectives focus on threats, internationalist perspectives on opportunities, then which is Trump's focus. I made a kind of a scenario with the premise that not only Trump himself, but also the American majority begin to shift the focus of foreign policy making from the cooperation. I mean, from the regular diplomacy towards North Korea to the tackling the North Korean threat. Actually, we need to understand the U.S. perception of North Korean power and North Korean threat. The horizontal arrow traces the change of the North Korean power. So if North Korean power increases and the U.S. perception of the threat from North Korea should go up. From point A to point B, the North Korean power increased, but the perception of the North Korean threat was not that high because there was only conventional weapons. But from point B to point C, excuse me, can you turn the screen towards this podium, this one, so Bill and Scott can. Yeah, there's a screen. Anyway, the point B to C, the North Korea began to develop nuclear weapons beyond the conventional weapons capability. And then U.S. perception of a threat changes. And point C is the critical point for North Korea and the U.S. because from the point C, North Korea reaches allegedly the final stage of nuclear and ICBM capability. And U.S. perception of North Korean threat dramatically changes. So if I draw that kind of approach with the timeline, period 1 shows that there was a threat from the North Korea as an alignment with the communist bloc. So North Korean economy boosted by 14.8. But the second period shows that there was a threat from North Korean isolation and fragility. North Korean economy was in trouble. But the third period shows that there is a threat from North Korean military advancement, and North Korean economy is under sanctions. U.S. responses to North Korea by time periods. The first one was containment, as in the U.S. contained the Soviet Union and the communist bloc, so it contained North Korea too. But the second period featured engagement, and third period may be pressure in other name the containment. So military options are under consideration. Well, if any issue falls into the category of the North Korea problem, it can be regarded for the U.S. as a regional issue, and it can be a threat to U.S. allies. But if the issue falls into the category of a North Korean nuclear problem, it is an American issue, and it'll be a threat to America directly. So during the second period, the nuclear issue begins to pop up, and at the third period, nuclear is combined with ICBM capability, and in the end, there will be a clash. So Trump's maximum pressure is increasing the level of military measures. Nowadays, with phase 1 measures, maritime interdiction is strengthened, but at the phase 2, military options will be brought into the reality. Having said that, there will be, simply speaking, 3 scenarios for North Korea: the grand bargaining, or tedious negotiations, or physical conflict. But the focus of my presentation is on this scenario for South Korea. Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea, made an analogy, sitting at driver's seat, and he wants to make the initiative in handling North Korean issues. Okay, the first scenario may be driving in the opposition to the U.S. interests. But there will be a possible crash with the U.S. and Japan, and of course there will be high payment with no insurance, because South Korea steps forward toward North Korea and China, and the South Korea will address the intranational conciliation and cooperation, but the alliance will be sacrificed. It's a scenario. Yeah. The second scenario will be the following the traffic. So there will be possible crash with North Korea and China. Of course, there will be also high payment, but there is insurance for South Korea. The third scenario will be stopping at the rest area. It can be a waste of time, or it can be a refresh time for everyone, but there will be extra payment in cash for South Korea. Wrap up my presentation here with one sentence. South Korea is living downstairs, and North Korea is upstairs. And if the U.S. attacks North Korea, South Korea will be damaged too. But South Korea can sustain with North Korea equipped with nuclear weapons. So that's a dilemma for South Korea. And the U.S. is also thinking of alternatives. Thank you for listening.
Bill?
I don't mind being stopped. Just tell me when to start. Yeah, I read Mr. Kim's paper, and I really liked it. I really did. So much so that I have a hard time disagreeing with it. It's almost like, and it's much more fun to disagree. So it's almost like I'd like to ask myself the questions that I ask of my own talks, like yours. He starts with the idea of North Korea not being a hermit kingdom, which I really like. A lot of us sort of think North Korea it's basically because the U.S. has never traded with North Korea. We think North Korea has always been this kind of hermit kind of economy that doesn't trade. It's nothing further from the truth. North Korea engaged heavily in trade with the Soviet Union. It's always traded a lot with China. It's traded hugely with Japan over time, with Europe. What's been happening, though, in the last 10 years since this nuclear business really started building up is one by one these groups of countries have cut off trade. You could call that sanctions. it's sort of I think how many rounds of sanctions have there been? I mean, it just goes on and on and on, back for at least 10 years. So here we are again talking about sanctions. Now we're more talking about U.S. sanctions because we just keep applying them some last week even. I want to point mostly, though, to the Chinese sanctions. To me, there's a huge change that's happened. Earlier changes were important. When Japan cut off trade 10 years ago, that was huge. Japan was one of their biggest trading partners. Of course, the Soviet Union collapsed. That made huge changes on North Korea's economy. South Korea pulled out after the Cheonan incident. So this series of ratcheting down of North Korea's trade with the world has been going on now for 10 years, at least 10 years, probably more than that. But it starts from the point where North Korea was heavily engaged in foreign trade. Nothing like a self-reliant like they like to talk about. Now, though, I would argue North Korea is becoming a hermit. And I say that only in the last 6 months. You can look at Chinese trade data. I think what basically happened in November a year ago, 15 months ago, after North Korea did, its fourth nuclear test, the Chinese really were upset and went to the UN. The UN put on, for the first time, both the Soviet Union and China both changed their tactics on the sanctions and started talking about, well, before that they'd always said the sanctions shouldn't hurt the livelihood of North Korean people. So we'll just sanction the military or nuclear related entities. We were pushing back on that, but that was always kind of the rule. Beginning 15 months ago, the Chinese and the Soviets or the Russians stopped talking that way. And they started applying economy-wide sanctions, a very big difference. We're just seeing that, and then throughout last year, several times, the Chinese added more and more sanctions. So we're really just seeing that, the impact. Beginning in November, Chinese imports from North Korea just plummeted. I just got the data yesterday for January now. December was terrible. I mean, the Chinese imports from North Korea fell 85, 90%. And then January data show, again, down, it's 85% below January a year ago. $30 million, I mean, come on, that's almost nothing. So officially, China is buying almost nothing from North Korea. No textiles, no non-ferrous metals, no coal, no. We see a lot of signs of these shipping, ship-to-ship transfers. All that's telling us is the sanctions are working. There's no way you do a ship-to-ship transfer if there wasn't some big, horrendous sanction that was keeping you from doing normal trade. So clearly, to me, the Chinese impact is just beginning to hit North Korea, in the last 3 or 4 months. I say that because I think we're a little bit impatient with sanctions. I know I was a year or two ago. I thought they weren't going to work. I didn't think they were going to work because China wasn't really on board. To me now, China is on board, at least for the time being. I don't know for how long. That's one of my worries. How long will China be on board? So if the trade is being impacted, what's happening? What do we see inside North Korea? Your story about the evolution of changes in North Korea is very right. I mean, over time, North Korea has, I think, been forced to. I don't call it reform because reform suggests a governmental kind of, let's reform the economy. I think it's all bottom up. I think the government has lost control over its own economy, and people are naturally doing their own things. And doing their own things, they're much more productive. I used to tease my friend Sid Seiler, on the NSC staff. He would run around town saying, North Korea can't have Pyongyang and can't have Pyongyang. Well, Pyongyang is nuclear power and economic growth. I said, Sid, you're not quite right. Well, he said, what do you mean? We're going to sanction them to death. I said, yeah, but they're not. I don't think it's what Kim wants to do, but the impact of the sanctions is actually is weakening the state of North Korea, which is loosening its control over its own people. So the economy is going to be growing. Private activities are growing rapidly in North Korea, giving it a boost that we all see. It's probably not what Kim Jong-Un wants, because this is definitely a threat to his regime. But you see better livelihood in North Korea now with the sanctions, I think, than beforehand. If you think that through, it's a little bit complicated, but I think if you're Kim Jong-un, you start reading this direction, it's not a good one for him. But now, going back to these Chinese, the drop in Chinese imports just in the last few months, we haven't, I must admit, I haven't seen the changes inside North Korea that I would have thought would have happened by now. The main thing I like to watch is the exchange rate and the price of rice, but especially right now, the exchange rate, which has been solid 8,000 won per dollar. I mean, it's like pegged. Before it jumbled around a little bit, but the last few months it's been absolutely pegged, 8,000 won. So how can they do that if they're losing $150 million a month on their current account? Certainly they're not getting any capital going in. Other parts of the current account must be coming down with remittances, all that. It must be a drain on North Korean foreign exchange, and yet the exchange rate is rock solid. So one question I have for you is, how are they doing that? I have some theories. The theories, they could, South Korean legislature said they're drawing down their $3 billion in reserves. Well, I don't know if that's right or not, but reserves won't last too long at that rate. I have some other ideas. All of them are sort of not good for Kim Jong-un. All of them are good for North Korean people because it's freeing up their system. It's kind of creating a market system in North Korea despite the best efforts of the regime to prevent it. So I'm thinking there's not a sustainable course here. I don't know what's going to happen with it. Some of my biggest concern is I don't know how long China will keep up these sanctions. I think it's tough for China to do this. And then I don't know our reactions. I don't know even, or South Korean reactions. My thinking, though, right now is I'm very optimistic. I've never been so optimistic because I think the rest of the world, now including China, are really putting the squeeze on the North Korean regime. That's beginning to affect. It's affected the price of oil, no doubt. Other prices it's not affected yet. Just the last thing, though, in this January data that I was just looking at today, Chinese North Korean imports from China have not really been affected so far until January. So January North Korean imports from China were down 30% from the year earlier figure. You have to be careful because February is a very weak month, obviously. So it's a little confusing looking at the data. But it looks to me, looking at North Korean imports from China, it's really starting to hurt. That's what we would expect. They don't have money to buy stuff, so they're not buying stuff. And that's including a lot of machinery. North Korean industry runs off of a lot of imported products from China. These kind of widgets are not coming in. And I think that's going to be really damaging, real tough pressure on Kim. So at that part and the exchange rate, I'm waiting for the exchange rate to explode. It doesn't. Maybe somebody should do something to make it explode. I don't know. But I think Kim is under huge economic pressure right now.
Thank you, Bill. Scott?
Well, I'm acutely aware that I'm a non-economist who has been asked to
the rest of this.
Address. Well, I don't know how it. There's a lot there. In fact, a lot more in terms of the slide presentation than what we got in advance. And so I first want to just acknowledge that Jung-ho, has really been, on the forefront in South Korea of examining the North Korean economy. I've seen him over the course of the years, and he's, very active as a participant in the South Korean discussion and analysis of what really is happening. And I think that the presentation reflected that. I think what I'm going to do is to just step back and offer a mea culpa for the North Korea watching community, and make about 5, kind of points about sanctions effects that are at the center, I think, of my concern as we go forward. And my mea culpa is really, maybe it's, I probably shouldn't attribute it collectively. We'll just make it a self-criticism. The thing that I think that I, regret missing the most over the course of the past 10 years of watching North Korea is the extent to which Kim Jong-un's embrace of the markets has enabled economic improvement that has in turn, I think, facilitated progress on the nuclear and missile development front. And I just, in a way, I don't think we appreciate how lucky we were that Kim Jong-il spent all of his time fighting the markets because it limited his choice set. And I think that Kim Jong-un's embrace of the markets, which I think was reflected in many different ways in Jung-ho's presentation, kind of underscores that North Korea really has benefited from what Andrei Lankov calls reform without opening. Is essentially, I think, what Kim Jong-un has pursued. And so now we do have this complicated hybrid economy, but it's really one that is driven by increasingly by reliance on a market mechanism. And one of the effects of the embrace of the markets that is actually beneficial to us is that economic interdependence, on the one hand, it has enabled North Korea to access the external global supply chain and embed itself in procurement through China, but it also has given a prospect that sanctions can actually be effective. Because, the historic analysis about sanctions was that North Korean economy was just simply too recessed, and North Korean exposure to the global economy was too limited to really expect that smart sanctions, or whatever you want to call them, were really going to have an effect. And I don't think that that is the case now. And Bill made a good case for, optimism, in that regard. Another observation that I think comes from Jung-ho's presentation is that the North Korean economy now is just more dynamic. There are more factors and inputs now, but from the macro to the micro level. I think it's just a much more complicated situation than we had seen previously. But as I look at sanctions effectiveness and the challenges that we have in terms of imposing the kind of international pressure campaign, there are a number of problems. And one of them, I think perhaps the most important one, that is really tough for economists to deal with, actually, is we've got an incomplete data set. When we look at the picture of North Korean trade with China or the rest of the world, we simply don't know what we don't know. And the New York Times today, is talking about North Korean trade with Syria in the area of chemical weapons, and I don't think there's an international database. There certainly is not a mirror statistic representation, under chemical weapons trade that you can go to that Syria has reported to the UN. We just don't know that, and so the incomplete data set generates a whole host of other problems as we think about sanction effectiveness. A second challenge, I think, that is really just reflected so clearly in the UN panel of experts body of work over time is North Korea has proven to be very effective at sanctions evasion. And we're really engaging in this kind of whack-a-mole approach as regards trying to address the countermeasures that North Korea takes in order to try to evade sanctions. And then I think a third challenge that we, may face at a certain point especially in the context of the shift from a goods-based approach in nuclear and missile sectors for the UN Security Council resolutions to a broader sectoral approach, is at some point, if the indicators that Bill Brown has talked about start to light up, we're going to see a situation that involves humanitarian distress in North Korea. You can't have price instability in North Korea and fluctuations in exchange rate without generation of humanitarian distress. And so that is going to raise some very complicated questions about the durability of our ability to put pressure on North Korea. It's easy to imagine that just like in the mid-1990s, as soon as we see refugee flows across the North Korea-China border, to imagine that China is going to push food across the border. And in an attempt to restabilize any, destabilization in North Korea. And then I think a fourth challenge for the sanctions regime is really the coordination problem. My way of thinking about this is that Secretary Tillerson talked about the rheostat, as though we have this knob where we can just ratchet up the pressure gradually, to the boiling point that is going to generate a change in direction by Kim Jong-Un. But the problem is that China has its hand on the rheostat. The U.S. hand is on China's hand. And it turns out that the Russians are the ones who are going in and out the back door with the open window. And so, controlling the temperature in a way that is going to, generate a tipping point is really extraordinarily difficult. And then I guess this is fifth point is related to the fact that we really are still ambiguous, I think, about the objective of the sanctions regime. This is the uncomfortable truth that for some, sanctions is the road to regime change, and for others, sanctions is the road to dialogue. The ambiguity around the objectives is going to make it very difficult, I think, to be able to determine their success, because success in the form of a return to dialogue for one observer is going to look like failure to another observer, and it may be that they are representatives of different governments trying to coordinate with each other. So that is an issue. And then the last one, which I think is probably on people's minds more and more, is the question of, okay, what if, dialogue, how do we coordinate this idea of pursuing pressure simultaneous with dialogue? And what would that look like? And I think it's pretty clear that there are a wide range of views with regards to that. And maybe I'll just close by, I guess the driver's seat analogy is kind of irresistible. It was very interesting to see how Jung-ho played, that out. I tried myself an image with regards to Moon Jae-in in the driver's seat recently, and I'm not sure, whether it is a good analogy or not. But for me, Moon in the driver's seat looks like a car that is going, up a one-way mountainous road. Perhaps at this point with the U.S. As the backseat driver blocking the rearview mirror, headed toward, a burned-out bridge, destination Pyongyang on the other side. And so the question is, you can't go forward. You've got to build the bridge if you're going to go forward, or you've got to find a way to back down in reverse. And so I'll just kind of make my small contribution to the driver's seat analogies with that.
Thank you, Scott. Before opening to questions, I have a couple of questions for each of you. We've talked about the driver's seat analogy, and I want to build off sort of Scott's point that, we don't know what we don't know. Rather than maybe a driver's seat, and this is slightly different, when you think about the issue of, we'll say, North Korea's access to resources as opposed to, trade or something. Scott brought up the point about the arms trade with Syria. Bruce Bechtel, who I've talked to, thinks that they probably earn around $1 billion a year from trade with Syria. He could be right. It's really going to be hard. Scott said there's no database we can go to. But let's for the moment give Bruce the benefit of the doubt and say that, they're earning $1 billion there. He thinks they probably do a similar amount of trade with Iran. So, if that's the case, there's, another $1 billion. So that's $2 billion that, we probably are going to have great difficulty taking away. Now, we always talk about how, China is 90% of North Korea's trade. If Bruce is right, I mean, this is clearly wrong. China is not 90%. They're probably the largest trading partner, but it's significantly, as a percentage, smaller. So the analogy I tend to think of, whether you agree with, Bruce's estimates or not, and there's other areas where you can find, revenue for North Korea, is that, if you think about how we find planets, you can see the wobble in the light, which tells you that there's gravitational pull, which tells you that there's something there. Jung-Ho, Bill, you both talked about, the idea of the, basically the won staying stable. So that tells us there's something else there that we're not seeing because, we're not seeing that wobble, if you will. At the same time, I'm going to be a little bit contradictory and say, I was looking at the Chinese trade data as well. One thing I noticed is that North Korea's imports from China in January were actually similar to the 2015 imports. And I wonder if maybe we should, give it a few more months because they had the huge surge in the coal value that January last year. And so maybe imports were sort of artificially up. So I guess the question is, depending on how long this goes, what does that tell us about, as Scott said, what we don't know and where we really need to be looking if we're going to have effective pressure? And then, Scott, I'd be curious, if you don't mind, you said that if North Korea starts to become unstable, that China would likely, push food or something in to restabilize it. If China isn't at some point going to be willing to basically allow for instability, how do we ever actually apply maximum pressure? Because if there's going to be that safety valve, what is really our next option?
Yeah, my incomplete description of the topic was quite provocative to the discussions. So they was willing to add more thoughtful ideas to my presentation. Regarding North Korean economic issues, we always touch the reliability issues of a data set. We don't get anything reliable from North Korea directly. Of course, we get some numbers from the official source of North Korea, but the original numbers are not shared with the outside. Well, Chinese statistics, as Bill mentioned, the trade data is quite manipulated by the statistics officers. Well, I don't know the exact reasons, but the frequent interaction and discussion with the Chinese scholars and officers and bankers, I reached the conclusion that the statistics, particularly of trade, do not immediately reflect what are interacted between China and North Korea. So I and other colleagues focusing on North Korean economy found several cases that Chinese statistics sometimes move the numbers ahead of the right time or after the time of interaction. Anyway, when the North Korean economy models through and seems to sustain stably, there must be some hidden sources of fund. As I mentioned in my presentation, there must be small businesses that do not care about the international sanctions, and they are called by the authority. They change the names or they re-register their companies and they continue their business. Internal source is must be various. Well, there are the economic officers who have been in charge of North Korea's trade for many decades, and they got involved with the trade and economic projects and contacting with foreigners, and they accumulate their own capitals somewhere. And internal sources are part of a North Korean economic kind of the prosperity only in Pyongyang. The exchange rate, yes, exchange rate seems to be packed. I told you about dual economy, the Korean won based economy and dollar-based economy. North Korean authority introduces or reform or improvement measures, whatever. They try to change policy and economic structure or system, the management, but they completely applied. They are not completely applied to the economic activities at various levels. Somebody may argue about if it is a top-down or bottom-up, but I bring the third opinion about that. The North Korean economy works in different areas respectively. So, of course, there must be impact of sanctions on North Korean economy, and the China is cooperating, and the impact is be more visible. But the Korean won-based economy, the flows the domestic resources, while the dollar-based economy continues to receive the supply of the hard currency. Well, I cannot explain completely, but those two areas are connected to the outside or to the other areas of economy, directly or indirectly. Well, of course, when the economy is sanctioned, there must be the symptoms of inflation. Price should change. Price should go up, but the rice price didn't go up as expected, and oil price rose up more than 40%. But other items look to be very stable. Anyway, considering those the discrepancies, we must think that those two economies, dual economies, run differently, separately. Okay, Scott,
And maybe because we're running short on time, if we can. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just a couple of points. A lot of them related to Scott's 6 points. I think, on the data problem, of course, there's always a data problem. But you have to keep things kind of in perspective. I don't believe they're getting $1 billion from Syria. If they are, they're probably spending $800 million to get the billion. We're talking about the margin. Moreover, we're talking about a change from the trend. I mean, it's indisputable to me that China isn't always their biggest trade partner. So we can look at their trend for 20 years, and China's always run a couple $100 million surplus with them. That's gone away. So economics, we like to talk about the margin, not just the absolute. So when you see a big change on the margin, that's usually meaningful. And the meaning is not so much on, speaking to Scott, and I think a lot of Washington people, a lot of Americans, a lot of foreigners, we overemphasize what we're doing, and we're not carefully looking at what's going on inside North Korea. To me, that's what we need to be looking at. Here, the Chinese have said, the UN told them, and they said, they agreed to, let's not import any textiles from North Korea anymore. Wow, can you imagine that, how that impacts North Korea is probably its second biggest industry. It wasn't so big in the past, but it's been growing. Probably you have 1 million or so employees of textile mills. Suddenly, what are they doing? They're not. Now, maybe they're exporting some to China, but China is saying no. So surely some of it filters through. But it's a lot more cost. Why do that if you're a Chinese side? Why do you want to buy North Korean textiles if everybody's saying don't? I don't think they are. I think we need to be, and this is just in the last few months, I think we need to be looking carefully. I don't see anybody doing it. It's frustrating. I don't see anybody looking at North Korean textile mills. What is going on there? Given what the Chinese say is a zero imports of textiles, which a few months ago was last year was $400 million. It's gone. That's got to be having some impacts. I don't see anybody in town here looking at that kind of issue. I'm just guessing there is an impact. And I'm guessing the impact is on Kim Jong-un's desk as we're speaking. I'm thinking he's looking at a lot of issues within his economy. What do we do about textile people? Oh, we just throw them out. No, we can't quite do that. What do we do if we're going to have this is a real good point Scott makes. What if there's every 5 or 6 years there's a bad weather, right? The crops go down. What if that's this year? How are we going to get corn this year? The rest of the world might not give us 1 million tons like they've given us before. What are we going to do about that? What are we going to do about this starting exchange rate? Here is, we don't even accept, our official rate is what, 131 per dollar? The markets out here are 8,001 per dollar. Now we've done a great job of anchoring that 8,000 rate. To me, it's so, like I said, it's such a pegged rate now. That's a policy decision in the North Korean government. We cannot let that black market rate waver from 8,001. Because if it goes to 10,000, everybody will jump on it and it'll be 80,000. So I think the North Korean government is fixated on this black market exchange rate, 8,001 per dollar. So how can they maintain it? There are different ways for them to maintain that 8,001. It's not, a lot of countries do that, have a pegged rate. Are they spending their own reserves? Maybe. Are they just really clamping down on their central bank? This is what I think. I think their central bank is not making any yuan loans. They're not creating yuan because it's a danger to the exchange rate. So they're at a very tight monetary policy that's keeping that yuan rate anchored. But if they're not giving out loans, what's happening to North Korean state enterprises that need money? They're not getting it. I'm thinking there's huge turmoil within that North Korean cabinet right now. Look at their budget, all these different issues. We sort of pretend like they don't exist because we don't see them. Okay, but they're there. Everybody has a budget. Everybody has to look at it. I'm kind of appalled at how little, how a lot we think we know about North Korea, but these key things we don't really investigate very well. I'm just saying. I'm thinking this Chinese action in the last 6 months has got to be having big impact on Kim Jong-un.
So I just really want to challenge Bill and Jung-Ho to try to do some of this subsectoral research on the impact of sanctions, because I think we desperately need that. Just as an example, What's the impact of no coal exports from North Korea? Well, actually, there should be more energy availability inside. You know, that's actually probably on balance a good thing. But some of these other sectors that involve more segments of lower class parts of the population, you know, targeting some of them, maybe fisheries, maybe textiles, that might actually be counterproductive to some of our interests. And just on Troy's question with regards to China, I mean, because of China's interest in stability, bottom line, I think what the Trump administration, you know, has started to do is not simply ask China for cooperation, but also shape the environment around China's thinking on its interaction with North Korea by justifying increased sanctions, including some secondary sanctions, on the basis of our own self-defensive interests. And I do think that that has had the effect of making China more forthcoming, but it has not changed China's strategic objectives of stability and ensuring that North Korea is a kind of buffer against potential instability and against potential geostrategic threat from the Korean Peninsula.
All right. I'd like to open to questions. If you'll please provide your name and affiliation. Yes. If you could just wait for the mic. Right here.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an Intel analyst and a former diplomat. When sanctions piled onto South Africa through time, they became better and better at import substitution and advancing technologies to the point that eventually we ended up buying their military vehicles. I think that's very significant, and I'm wondering if, in the case of North Korea, are sanctions in fact impelling Juche? And isn't that, in fact, the very best monitor of whether sanctions are having an effect?
But if we just keep our answers short.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think what we're seeing is much more North Korean domestic production of consumer goods, of things feeding their own market. It's a very interesting process. One thing I did not say is I think the sanctions really, in my mind, they have not been very good. U.S. sanctions are not very good at throwing wedges at the North Korean economy. To me, we need to be dividing and conquering, helping some firms, some private markets. We should be helping those, and we should be slamming the state markets, the slave markets. I think what a lot of is happening now is growth of market private activities producing shampoo. There's North Korean Daily article just yesterday talking about North Korean products being developed, not imported from China. It's all to me a very good thing. But it's not. I don't think it's helping the regime. I think it's helping the private activities, which are really antithetical to the socialist regime.
You're in the same row.
Sorry, yeah. Hi, my name is Yaju Yang from TV Asahi. So basically, recently, South Korea is conducting the so-called moonshine policy. Even though the president didn't say he had a specific plan for the economic cooperation with to engaging with the DPRK, but based on his very progressive attitude, especially the cooperation on the Olympics and the Winter Olympics. Do you think I think that the kind of economic engagement with DPRK is on his agenda. Do you think the kind of plan or the very progressive attitude of South Korea will cause any influence on the effectiveness of the international economic sanctions? Or do you think that the prayers such as sanctions or even with a military operation is better to deal with the DPRK issues or the very soft, attitudes such as sunshine or moonshine policy is more effective? This is what I think.
So I guess basically, would economic engagement undermine sanctions, and is engagement better or sanctions?
I have a quick answer. I think one problem is this term engagement is how do you engage? In the West, including South Korea, but fault of everybody, really, including the U.S., our engagement with economic engagement with North Korea has been of an aid kind of mentality, that we have to help North Korea. That has meant that we've helped the regime, the government of North Korea. We have penalized the people of North Korea. Aid is a very corrupting activity. We don't allow foreign aid into the U.S. for good reason. We call it dumping. So I think a right approach for the Moon government, I don't know which way they're leaning. I would not give any aid to North Korea. I would not do Kaesong. Kaesong is a state enterprise. It's not good for the people. But if they can engage in ways that produce private results, pay people directly is the most important thing. Don't pay a slave owner. Pay the slave. That way, a right kind of engagement can be very positive, and I really want that to happen.
With the exception of an $8 million pledge of humanitarian assistance to South Korea, at present, I think the U.S. and South Korea are on the same page on sanctions. And the issue of economic cooperation with North Korea is very much an over-the-horizon issue that I think the Moon administration, thus far, there's no indication that they do not recognize that they've got to find some way to address the nuclear issue as a prerequisite to doing anything substantial on the economic cooperation side. There is a domestic debate that is probably trying to eat around the edges of that, but at present, I think that the likelihood of any kind of imminent large-scale opening of economic cooperation, well, it's something that would have to happen as a result of a summit, and a summit probably, cannot occur unless there is some bounding of North Korea's nuclear program, as was the case with the two prior summits.
Yeah, South Korean government had no other options but to make exemptions to sanctions measures against North Korean visitors this time. Not only sanctions over persons, but also over institutions and economic transaction cases will be a serious problem. While the humanitarian assistance may be put on the table as a non-political issue, but it will be followed by the economic cooperation projects that should be resumed by both sides. So in the case of South Korean government has a headache of how to make exemptions or how to make third alternatives to the U.S.
Okay, and let's let this gentleman here.
Hi, I'm Ashton Orms, retired from the U.S. government, former associate of Bill's. Bill, really a question for you, and I obviously haven't been paying attention. I was very surprised, Dr. Kim, to see that there's now a U.S. sanction, a UNSCR sanction on North Korea importing aviation fuel. I mean, the strategic implication, not just for commercial aviation, but the North Korean Air Force is pretty obvious from this. And my impression, I think probably under Bill's tutelage in the past, is that most of the aviation fuel in North Korea is coming in from China. So the question really, Bill, is, and I think I know the answer from some of your previous comments, but are we seeing this actually happening? Are the Chinese really cutting off aviation fuel exports to North Korea? Too soon to tell. Is this something else we should be watching? Thanks.
Yeah, they are now sanctioned recently. All petroleum products under a cap, even a severe cap. And they're according to the data that everybody might disagree with, the Chinese are saying they're not shipping aviation kerosene, really, or any petroleum products. The last month, none. Now, the problem with China, I admit, and I've been pushing this for years, is China gives North Korea about 600,000 tons of crude oil through that pipeline to their North Korean refinery. And of course, the refinery can make easy to make kerosene out of it. It's not a big deal. They can take that 600,000, which is about 2/3 of North Korea's petroleum supply, and they can ship it to wherever they want. And I'm sure the military gets a big claim on that. As Kim was saying, though, the price of fuels, gasoline especially, but also kerosene and diesel, they actually like tripled for a few weeks and then dropped. But they're still like 50% higher than they were. This is in dollar terms. So they price it all in dollars. You buy gasoline in dollars. Use dollar bills to buy gasoline in North Korea. And it's about $6 a gallon. It's expensive gasoline. So yeah, the petroleum products generally are under not the tight squeeze because of this crude oil that flows in. Why don't the Chinese, I say, at least make the North Koreans pay for it? I think from the Chinese perspective, this is their last big lever that they want to hold back in case North Korea does something really atrocious. They can slam it, or they can use that as a big lever. I think that's the way the Chinese are thinking. But yeah, and of course China, no, I don't think anybody wants to kill North Korean economy. Absolutely preventing any oil going into the country or anything really would. It's like a wartime embargo. We're not doing that on North Korea. What we're trying to do is on the margin make the Kim regime nervous that the economy is coming unglued, that he's losing control of it. That's what my argument is.
A couple of resolutions ago, I believe that it was actually the Russians that were the greatest. They were taking the lead on resistance to closing the loopholes on aviation fuel. So I think you have to take Beijing and Moscow into account in that particular sector.
Chris Nelson.
Thanks so much. Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. Really great discussion. Thank you. It's been interesting. We're talking about sanctions and pressure and all that, and we haven't talked about the Psy war that's been going on for the last several months, and that is the threats of, if you want to call it bloody nose or not. The White House is pretending they've never said that, but, whatever you want to call it, there have been a lot of threats. Recently, when I would write about it, I would hear from people saying, well, no, calm down, because actually sanctions are starting to work. Do you think there's a link between increased sanctions and the American threats, or is that coincidental? And ironically, are perhaps threats of really disastrous American action the best incentive for sanctions? How should we be thinking about the psychological role of fear of the United States doing the dangerous thing to try to get other people to do the right thing? And how do you think that might play out? What do you worry about when you're looking at, okay, so we're not talking bloody nose now, but in 3 weeks after, if there's another nuke test or an ICBM test, oh my God, what are we talking about? Are we in a race between sanctions and the military option? I'm asking the same question 3 or 4 different ways, but I'd love to hear how you break out thinking about the extreme use of American force as a sanctions reinforcer. Thanks. The easy question,
Yeah, you might have noticed I did an article on the Washington Post's bloody nose editorial, which I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm thinking people are misunderstanding deterrence. And a bloody nose to me is not all-out war. In fact, that's the whole idea. The notion of it is you fight back a little bit, punch back a little bit. And I'm thinking mostly, if we look back at the Jong-Un case back in, 2010, Ash? Ash is the expert on the submarine warfare business. And I lost a coffee bet with him because I thought, gee, there's no hole in the round hole in the Jong-Un. So where'd the torpedo go? Well, it's complicated, but the torpedo blows up underneath, and clearly a North Korean submarine with a torpedo sank the Jong-Un by 2010, and then the PY. That, to me, in hindsight, I'm not saying I was advocating at the time, that required a bloody nose. We should South Korea, Lee Myung-bak, or us should have given the young leader, he was just in training then, Kim Jong-Un, a bloody nose for that incredible warlike attack. That, to me, is kind of the messaging that we're giving, hopefully that we're giving, is not that we're going to nuke North Korea, but we're going to give them a bloody nose if they do something nasty like that. If they do things we don't like, we're going to fight back. If you think about, since the Korean War, we really have not given North Korea a bloody nose. I think it's a mistake, so that if you want deterrence, Kim Jong-un has to be afraid that we might give him a bloody nose. And I don't mean tear up this whole country. But I would argue to make North Korea afraid, well, the only way we're going to get North Korea to change is they're going to have to be afraid. And I don't even mean nuclear issues. To me, the main problem in North Korea is their dadgum socialist system. That drives everything. They can't live in the rest of the world the way they are, so they need nuclear weapons to defend themselves. We need to be encouraging, pushing, forcing a change in that system. That's where I push back on your number one point. To me, if North Korea is reforming underneath, that's great news, okay? I would trade a few nukes in the cave somewhere for a reformed North Korea. Now, other people might, I agree, might not. But the whole, I think the gist of your question is just right, though. What is the psychology that we can use against the regime to make them afraid enough to reform? Reform requires a sense of fear. None of us will reform unless we're afraid of something. And I'm suggesting double-sided, bloody nose kind of worry, and more important for me is this pulling down their socialist system and replacing it with a market system. That, to me, should strike real fear with Kim Jong-un.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so why don't we take these last three questions as a group? We'll start with the gentleman here in the back and then move to Larry and Gil.
Dan Lieberman, I'm a writer. You showed North Korea as being a growing threat, but from their perspective, I don't see where North Korea can ever gain by any offensive action against anyone else. I mean, they'll be obliterated in no time. So from their standpoint, what we call a threat isn't really a counter threat. Isn't it they who feel threatened? I mean, because we could take offensive action, which they probably could not defend against. So isn't their development of weapons really more of a counter threat and should be looked upon that way?
Larry Nix from ICUS and CSIS. I want to look at the future, perhaps toward the end of this year, and ask you how durable do you think the UN sanctions regime will be at that point in time, toward the end of this year, if, as CIA Director Pompeo has predicted, and Kim Jong-Un projected in his New Year's speech, that we see probably by the summer of this year clear evidence that North Korea is in fact doing what Kim said in his New Year's address, starting to build an arsenal of ICBMs that can hit the United States. If this happens, if North Korea presents the world with a fait accompli, do you think governments like China and Russia and perhaps other governments as well are going to remain as committed to sanctions, however committed China and Russia actually are, as they are now? Or could we expect to see, as the Global Times editorialized recently, the view that sanctions haven't worked, therefore it's time for new, more accommodating policies towards North Korea? Vladimir Putin is talking about how successful a leader Kim Jong-un is, and you have the history of India and Pakistan and how opposition to their nuclear programs dissipated. And they were able to present the world with a fait accompli, that they had, in fact, a nuclear arsenal.
Gil Rosman, the ASEAN Forum. Following up on the Russian references so far, do we have good evidence how well Russia is enforcing sanctions? We know that a year ago or so they were increasing trade with North Korea quite a bit. They have a new ship that was plying back and forth between Vladivostok and North Korea. It's the same ship that used to go to Niigata. What do we know about the enforcement on the Russian side, and specifically some of the areas which are most sensitive, like aviation fuel, whether Russia has taken them very seriously?
Okay, why don't we start with Scott so we can give Dr. Kim the last word, but if you could each keep your responses to just a minute or two since we're short on time.
Okay, well, I'll just take the last one, I guess, because Russian enforcement, has been voiced as a concern at lower levels within the U.S. government, and now obviously it's reached to Trump. And so there are clearly concerns that Russia is backfilling or essentially, economically playing a spoiler role. And in some ways, it makes sense because, the Russians, are being sanctioned by the U.S. while they're being asked to sanction North Korea. And I think that from the perspective of the Russian leadership, it just makes no sense whatsoever. And so, frankly, it's a rational act for Putin to seek opportunities to play a spoiler role in North Korea.
Yeah, I don't know the data, but like 20 years ago, Russia, Soviet Union traded a couple $1 billion a year with North Korea. Last year, they said they traded $10 million. A ship is virtually nothing. They had a big program 3 years ago that they were going to invest billions of dollars in North Korean infrastructure. That's gone to nothing. So yeah, some ships, some trade obviously occurs. But again, it's what I'm talking about is on the margin. It's a very good thing that Soviet Union or Russia is not playing ball with North Korea. Maybe on the margin. And I suspect that it's very costly for the North Koreans. The Russians don't give away anything. The other two questions put together, it's very important, and we don't know. My presumption is North Korea still wants South Korea, which to me is the name of the game. That's why we're there in South Korea to prevent North Korean takeover. If North Korea could convince me, same with your question, if they could convince me that they're going to be happy just in themselves, they're part of their peninsula, and not bother South Korea, not bother the rest of the world, well, maybe we could tolerate nuclear weapons. Why then would they need them? I don't know. My presumption, though, and I take Kim Jong-un's New Year's speech as literal, he still wants unification. So that, to me, makes everything different. North Korea can chip away using its own nuclear umbrella to do all kinds of dastardly deeds in South Korea and pull it down. South Korea is vulnerable that way. I think it's a very logical argument for North Korea to try to do that, but it's also argument for us to stop it doing that. For the ICBMs, I kind of agree with him. I don't see that ICBMs is a game changer. To me, the hydrogen bomb is a game changer that we already saw. The big bomb that they did a few months ago, that is a game changer, and that's already changed. So to me, that puts huge impetus on us to get North Korea under control.
Well, the situation in 2018 will be quite complicated because of the geopolitics in which Chinese President Xi Jinping's tenure extends in the future, and Xi Jinping will not give up over North Korea. And the South Korea-U.S. alliance is to be renewed or reshaped if it is not redefined. Well, there are at the same time security and trade issues popped up to the front, and they need to be in cooperation, but at the same time they are in kind of conflict. So the political economy of alliance will change the landscape. And one more, there is a Japan factor. Japan has been pushing the U.S. and the UN to heighten the sanction level, and Japan will be a kind of the acting leader in the area of the sanctions against North Korea. So there will be more complicated messages made by those factors. And the last thing is, I mentioned the high payment by options for South Korea or the U.S. or other countries. But North Korea doesn't care about the payment. South Korea doesn't accumulate the experiences of calculating. So in the sense, the interactions will be quite complicated.
Thank you. And Larry, I would just add one thing. I would actually reshape your question. It's not a question of Iran and Pakistan, but I mean, look at Iraq. You know, eventually sanctions will leak. It's just a question of time. We probably only have a couple years, no matter what, that, you know, it'll hold fairly firmly. So I'd maybe look at it that way. But with that, I do have one other thing I want to say, and I was remiss in the beginning. Scott Snyder actually has a new book out on South Korean foreign policy. The name escapes me at the moment, but it's available on Amazon. South Korea at the crossroads.
Yes.
So go to Amazon. I'm sure Scott would appreciate your purchase. With that, if you'll thank me, this has been a really great discussion. I think we've all learned a lot. Thank you very much.